Hello, and thank you for joining us tonight. We have a very special series of programs planned for you over the coming months, with tonight kicking off the Historic Artist Homes and Studios virtual road trip from Boise, Idaho at the James Castle House. My name is Rachel Reichert, and I am going to be your guide over the next few months. I'm also the Cultural Sites Manager overseeing the James Castle House and an executive committee member of the Historic Artist Homes and Studios program. With me tonight is Valerie Balint. Hello, Valerie. The program manager for the Historic Artist Homes and Studios program. Kristen Hill. Hello, Kristen. Kristen is the Cultural Sites program coordinator at the James Castle House. We also have Frances Burnett, who will be offering ASL interpretation during tonight's event. We are excited to bring you into the homes and studios, even if it is virtually, to learn more about 6 remarkable artists and the spaces that supported their art making practices. As you may know, tonight's tour is one in a suite of 6 tours, each exploring a different artist home and studio offered monthly through August. If you haven't signed up for those upcoming tours, we'll add a link in the chat where you can learn more. For those of you just learning about the Historic Artist Homes and Studios program, also known as HAHS, this is a program of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, which is currently a coalition of 48 museums that were previously homes and working studios of many American artists. Through its support and advocacy, HAHS is helping to preserve the nation's legacy of creativity in the visual arts. This program aims to connect meaningful visitor experiences at authentic creative places. All HAHS sites are public spaces, and when it's safe to do so, I hope we can all venture out into the world and visit these incredible museums in person. I also highly recommend visiting HAHS online to learn more about these and many other homes and studios they support. You can learn more at artisthomes.org or by joining their mailing list, or engaging with them in a variety of different social media platforms, and we'll add those links in the chat as well. So before we get started, I'd like to address a few housekeeping items. We will have an opportunity to answer your questions at the end of tonight's tour, so please feel free to send your questions in to us through the Q&A box throughout this presentation. And for optimal viewing of tonight's tour, please select the view options at the top of your screen and select side-by-side mode. So tonight's event is being recorded and will be made available online in the coming weeks. You'll find this and other recordings located both at the James Castle House as well as the Historic Artist Homes and Studios YouTube channels. So just to set the stage for this road trip, I'd like to start with a few travel notes. Because we'll be starting from Boise, Idaho, I'm going to make the assumption that most of you will be flying into Boise to join us on this road trip. So when flying into this landlocked mid-sized city, you'll experience hundreds of thousands of acres of mountainous national forest land right outside your airplane window just before landing in a high desert landscape peppered with sagebrush and basalt. Once you land in the city of trees, you'll drive 20 minutes through downtown, then quickly move into a more suburban landscape, landing us in Boise's Collister neighborhood. This neighborhood was originally quite rural, but over time, its small farms quickly were replaced with many subdivisions. The James Castle House is located smack dab in the middle of what is now an active suburban neighborhood with residential neighbors surrounding the house. So to give us some perspective of what it feels like when you arrive in Boise and then particularly at the James Castle House, I've asked Valerie Balint, who impressively has visited all 48 HAHS sites, to share her experience both in Idaho and at the James Castle House. So Valerie, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you, Rachel. And thanks to you and everyone at the James Castle House for spearheading this virtual road trip in collaboration with the Historic Artist Homes and Studios program, the first of wide-scale public programming HAHS has ever undertaken. And I'm delighted to be back at the James Castle House once again, albeit virtually, and to the site to have you all experience the wonder that I first encountered on my own trip to Boise and to the site in spring 2018. I was honored to be invited to participate in the 3-day symposium and celebration marking the opening of the site for public visitation. And it has been so inspiring and fulfilling to watch the growth of the site and its programming in just a few short years. I will confess that I had never been to this region of the country prior to setting out for the symposium. As someone who has lived in both the Northeast and the Pacific Northwest and traveled widely, the natural splendor and booming community present in Boise and the surrounding area were a revelation to me. My first full day of the trip, I had the rare opportunity, hosted by the James Castle House, to travel an hour north of the city into Garden Valley, the childhood home of James Castle. I can still conjure the scent of the trees, the feel of the dry breeze, and the taste of the windswept dust on my lips, all while taking in the grand scale of the plateaus and valleys set against the mountain range. There is something visceral about standing on the terra firma of someone's place of childhood and understanding the impact it has on the rest of their lives. So I'd urge you to take a trip into this part of the state to immerse yourself not just in the beauty of the region, but to better understand James Castle, his biography, of course, but also how that later impacted his work. During my stay in Boise, I had the pleasure of enjoying some of the other historical and cultural resources the city has to offer. And I would urge all of you to do the same, whether you are a local who may have put off visiting these places, as we are all apt to do in our own hometowns, or if you come from far afield. I love stepping into the Egyptian theater, a wonderful example of a functioning historic theater, something I personally try to seek out whenever I am traveling. It's the oldest theater in the city and dates to 1927, inspired by the Egyptian revival movement. And it's filled with ornate frescoes and pillars capped by lotus buds, all in a rich array of saturated pigments and gilding. So go to a performance or just walk around and take in the visual feast of this building. I also had the pleasure of staying at a renovated mid-century motel, The Modern, where you can sip cocktails and enjoy convivial conversation, as we all did in the courtyard. And nearby, you can walk around, as I did, the historic Linen District, boasting some wonderful architecture from the 19th century and excellent examples of adaptively reused space. No pilgrimage to the castle site is complete without a visit to the Boise Museum of Art, which boasts a strong collection of his work, but where you can also learn about other historical artists in the region, including Indigenous artists, as well as the thriving community of young creatives that are drawn to Boise today, and in fact, some of whom actually work at the castle site. Of course, the highlight of my entire experience was my indoctrination to the James Castle House. It is a small, unassuming building in the middle of a residential suburb. As I stood in front of it for the first time, I was immediately struck by the magnitude of the fact that Castle produced myriad works of artistic mastery out of this humble space and the nearby shed, both gems hidden in plain sight in this suburban enclave. I was also acutely aware that in the past, sites like this have not been preserved, neither for artists working outside of traditional norms, nor those buildings representing conventional vernacular forms of the everyday person. It's hard to put into words what happened for so many of us when we stepped into that house for the very first time. Those of us who presented at the symposium spoke about it together, our emotional response, in hushed voices over meals, and even years later in email exchanges, it still lingers. As you will see, the space is now incredibly open, a contrast in some ways to how small it may have been, full of furniture when Castle was living there. The visual silence afforded by the white walls and largely spare rooms provides a corollary to the auditory silence Castle lived with all his life in this very space. It's at times calming and at other times incredibly disquieting, but it is always extraordinarily powerful and moving. Through the small vignettes of castle materials on view, many pulled during the excavation and restoration from this very site, you are forced to look closely at the ingenious way he can employ literally anything to make his art. You will learn on your tour this evening the other wonderful narratives around this self-determined artist, the recent commitment to save the site, and its ongoing engaging programming. But for me, being at that site embodied some pretty basic, simple truths. There is no world so circumscribed that can inhibit the sheer will of creative genius, and that everyone has a basic human need to create and to communicate. Castle proves it lies in all of us, and we only need to ignite it. So I hope you will think about these ideas as we embark on our journey this evening. And thank you again, Rachel, for all your efforts in bringing us all together.
Thanks so much, Valerie. It's such a treat to hear your perspective of the site and the experiences that you had when you came to Idaho. Just so everybody knows, this image that we're looking at here on the screen is a photograph of Garden Valley, sort of helping describe some of what Valerie was sharing with us about her experience coming to Idaho and particularly going up to Garden Valley while she was here. So now I want to pass this on to Kristen Hill, who is actually inside the museum right now, who's going to share more about James Castle and his home in Boise, Idaho.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you, Valerie. That was really beautiful. So as Rachel mentioned, my name is Kristen Hill. I'm the Cultural Sites Program Coordinator at the James Castle House. Tonight, I'm going to take you into two spaces that are unique to our museum and introduce you to the remarkable human who lived there. So the James Castle House is a small museum responsible for the family home and two historic outbuildings where James Castle lived and worked for over 4 decades. Today, the house offers artist residencies, exhibitions, community programs, and ongoing interpretation of Castle's tremendous legacy. Owned and operated by the City of Boise's Department of Arts and History, our work on site is entirely focused on providing public access to James Castle, his spaces, and the city's collection of Castle's art and artifacts. It would be very short-sighted of us to think the history of the site we're visiting tonight starts at the moment the artist arrived. Before we begin talking about the James Castle House at 5015 Eugene Street in Boise, Idaho, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the ancestral, cultural, traditional, and unceded territory of the Shoshone, Bannock, and Northern Paiute people whose land the site is on today. So for those of you needing an introduction to James Castle, also commonly referred to by his family as Jimmy, he was born 50 miles north of Boise in Garden Valley, Idaho on September 25th, 1899. Castle was born 2 months premature and profoundly deaf, and so was largely excused from daily farm chores, which allowed him to spend all of his time drawing. This daily practice continued throughout his entire life and created his observation and imagination built a unique vocabulary of visual imagery that he used throughout his life. And just a note, this is a picture of James Castle sitting inside the living room at the Eugene Street home. So James Castle's formal education was minimal. We don't know if he attended elementary school in Garden Valley, but we do know he attended the Idaho School for the Deaf and Blind in Gooding, Idaho from about age 10 to 15. So it was at a time prior to the 1950s where education for the deaf was focused on the oral method, where students were taught to communicate verbally through imitating mouth shapes and breathing patterns of speech to sound out words. So for someone with no experience of spoken language, this method is extremely difficult, if not impossible to learn. So after a few years at the Idaho School, James returned home to Garden Valley and presumably never learned to read, write, speak, or use formal sign language. And here we're looking at side by side a drawing and photograph of the boys' dormitory at the Idaho School for the Deaf and Blind. And this picture here on the right shows a young and dapper James Castle ready to go in his school uniform. And on the left, we are looking at the Castle family home that was in Garden Valley. Castle's parents, Frank and Mary, ran a post office and general store out of their home in Garden Valley to supplement their income as farmers. So because of this, James Castle was exposed from a very young age to an immense amount of print materials, such as magazines, catalogs, letters, and postcards. And these materials would influence Castle's work greatly, becoming both the subject matter and the substrates for his future works, and helping him to develop a keen eye for 20th century material and visual culture. So here we are looking at a few of James Castle's images on his drawings, but we're looking at the back sides of them. So we're able to get a sense of the types of materials that he frequently worked on, which was sort of anything and everything. But visible here, we will notice, the vanilla ice cream, the margarine package. At the far right, we have a label that was from a cloth company. And at the bottom right, it's a little hard to see when it's small, but it was a doctor's bill for his brother-in-law, Guy Wade, from 1956. So living most of his life in humble conditions and remote areas, Castle had very little access to store-bought art materials. So he would develop his own tools and techniques using whatever he had at hand, such as what we're looking at here, laundry bluing, some random papers from around the house, some bits of string and twine. And then here, we'll talk a little bit further about this shortly, but we have on the left a jar of soot, and on the right, an array of handmade tools. So these tools and techniques really create the guidelines for how we think about the types of artwork Castle created. Today, we often group his artworks into 5 categories: soot and spit, color works, handmade books, text works, and constructions. So each of those are shown here. We're going to go into more depth on each of them in just a moment, but just take a second to look at this lovely array. All right, so starting here with the soot and spit. So soot and spit is what Castle is most well known for. He would create really tonally complex drawings that ranged from the precise and highly detailed to the completely abstract. The span of these works demonstrate his understanding of linear perspective, composition, and contrast. So we've got a pretty good range of those works here. So while Castle is less well known for these, he also created a wide range of color works. These pieces were usually created on the waxy inside surfaces of food packaging. He would wet and then rough up these surfaces with a stick or a razor to create additional tooth and absorbency. So for his paints, Castle would use a combination of traditional materials such as crayons and inks to much more unexpected materials like the laundry bluing we saw earlier, and sometimes makeup. Castle was especially well known to soak highly pigmented papers like crepe paper or wrapping paper in water, and then feed the color from those into his prepared surfaces. So you can see some of these have a really nice dreamy look, and that is likely from that use of color. So the variety of color materials create a wide range of dynamic mark making throughout his color works. Another category of Castle's works are his handmade books. He created small books with interior pages made from found paper and hand sewn into covers that often feature cigarette packaging or labels from canned goods, which you can see here with the cranberry sauce and Lucky Strike covers. His books most often did not tell a linear narrative, but usually they displayed an aesthetic continuation within each book. So for instance, the book that we see at the center top has kind of variations of something that looks like a mailing envelope combined with stuff from magazines, some stamps and things like that. And just a note, the bottom image here that looks kind of like it's an album, like a portrait album, is actually drawn on the interior of a book. So there's print text underneath the drawing. So Castle's text works are some of the most intriguing of his works due to the fact that he did not have access to any formal language. He did, however, show an incredibly nuanced understanding of the way in which written language functions. He displays actual text and indicated text throughout all of his work using his own alphabet, some thick black lines and thin squiggly ones to indicate captions or sentences, and even takes his love of calendars into the fold, creating complex grids full of imagery and patterns accompanied by text of his own invention. So I just want to call out everyone's attention to this beautiful image on the lower left-hand side that shows Castle's alphabet in full. So he combined the Roman alphabet, some Cyrillic and Greek characters, as well as several characters of his own invention. And with each of these, they had a capital and a lowercase version. So it was a very complete system that he was using. So the constructions that Castle made, most of the work that he did was two-dimensional, but he did sometimes venture into the creation of three-dimensional works, which are called typically constructions. And these pieces were made by layering up paper, cardboard, and other household materials, which would be bound and decorated using twine and fabric, and sometimes the application of additional materials such as color, which resulted in the works being incredibly dimensional. You can see here in this bird figure on the left that the wings actually cast a shadow. It is really very three-dimensional. And this image to the right of that, this is two separate pieces, and each of them shows this water pitcher from a different perspective. He actually did 4 different views of this same water pitcher. So while Castle spent his life making artwork, almost all of what he created before moving to the Boise property was lost as the family moved and he was unable to bring his large amounts of work along. The first time this happened was in 1923 when the Castle family moved from Garden Valley to Star, which was another rural Idaho location. The family remained in Star for almost 10 years, during which time James's father, Frank, passed away. So newly widowed, Mary Castle left the Star homestead for closer access to Boise, purchasing a 5-acre farm in December of 1931. This rural lot, which was initially addressed as Rural Route 3, sat just outside of city limits and came with a small single-room board and batten house and several small outbuildings. James moved to the Boise property with his mother, again leaving his work behind in the move. And Mary and James were soon joined by his younger sister, Peggy, her husband, Guy Wade, and their children. So this image on the left shows a lovely picture of Peggy and Guy with their first child. And on the right, there is an image of James Castle raking the Eugene Street property. James ultimately spent over 46 years of his life at the Boise property. The Eugene Street home really remained the center of family life and activity, but there were 2 unique spaces that defined James Castle's life here. One space was the small shed, which is believed to have already been on site prior to the family's arrival, and the other, the cozy cottage trailer, was acquired roughly 3 decades later, soon after James's introduction into the art world. It is here in Boise where James Castle would later create thousands of artworks and the majority of the work we have come to know him by today. So here is the shed. The shed is a small structure that sits roughly 15 feet from the main house. Because of the tight quarters inside the house, James took this small shed for use as his own private living and working space shortly after the family moved to the site. This humble little structure was the centerpiece of James's existence for over 30 years. It was a place of uninterrupted solitude and peace and sort of just a refuge from the ever-expanding family that was living inside the main home. This is the Cozy Cottage trailer. It made its way to the property in 1963. It was purchased for James by his sister Peggy, who became his caretaker after his mother died. After years of drawing what the family referred to as his dream home, James was finally able to have his own fully functional living space. So these structures made it possible for James to remain close to his family while also giving him the space and privacy to create work to his heart's content. We believe the shed and trailer are crucial components to experiencing James Castle. As you can see in this image, these structures have seen significant weathering over the decades following Castle's death. These two spaces are key in supporting our ongoing research to better understand Castle's life and art practice. And today they are undergoing planning efforts for long-term interpretation and conservation with the hope of making them available to visitors of the museum in the future. So I am delighted to offer you a rare glimpse into one of these remarkable spaces, the Cozy Cottage trailer. This short video tour offers an interior view in its current condition and shows an unaltered interior Castle would have been familiar with. All right, so we're looking at the exterior of the trailer here. You can see that weathering very evidently with the paint that's peeling away. The front door to the trailer had two panels. The top was a window and the bottom was a wooden panel that was removable to reveal a screen, so it would allow some fresh air into this little home. And it has this lovely robin's egg blue paint that's still surprisingly intact. As we step into the space, we're actually looking at James Castle's workspace. So he had a desk that he worked at that was just next to those shelves. He was able to take advantage of the ample light the perpendicular windows allowed in, which I think was a step up from what the shed would allow for him. There was also a couple of wall sconces, if you see, next to that window. So when it was darker outside, he was still able to have some light to work by. Another difference from the shed here, there was a kitchen in this trailer. So it was with the idea of being fully functional. It was a kitchen that had a refrigerator. You can see here that there's a stove and an oven. So Castle could theoretically cook. We don't think that he did much cooking because he was much more likely to enjoy the meals that his family was providing and enjoy time with them. You can also see that there are quite a bit of cabinets and cupboards and shelves in here. So he was able to have ample space to store his supplies and works. There is a sink, so he could actually wash his hands while working with messy materials like soot. And there's a little bit of additional space back here. There's a separate closet and there's some drawers that are just visible on the right. So this would have been the bedroom area that we're entering. The family had built out an extension while Castle was living there to give him a little bit more space. It had to be removed in order to move the trailer. So what we're seeing now is what they covered that removal with. And then this very narrow door that we're facing is actually, surprisingly, the door to a bathroom, which manages to have both a toilet and a shower in it. It's pretty amazing, but definitely allowed for more independence for James Castle than he would have had before. So you can see why this space meant so much to James, why it was so special, and ultimately was his dream home for the last 14 years of his life. So now, in order to keep the trailer protected while developing a long-term conservation plan, it is currently residing in a more secure indoor environment. You can see here. Okay, so now onto the house itself. The city of Boise purchased the 5015 Eugene Street property in 2015 and spent 2.5 years of research, program development, and site preservation and construction before opening to the public in April 2018. Visitors now have an opportunity to experience the site and learn more about James Castle through a variety of ongoing programs. So our general store, which we're looking at now, is a nod to the store and post office Castle's parents ran in Garden Valley, and it offers books and products relating to James Castle and the exhibitions on site. Our exhibitions mostly take place in this gallery, which is in the historic family home. This incredible space still features many original parts of the house, such as the beautiful hardwood floors and the exposed rafters that we can see in these images that show the building's changes throughout the decades as the family added on to accommodate their needs. So our exhibitions focus on bringing new context to the work and life of James Castle, providing visitors with a deeper understanding and appreciation of his life and art. Just off the main gallery sits another very special room. This small room was used as a bedroom by Castle's mother, Mary, until her death in 1948, and now holds an exhibition focusing on the materials that Castle worked with and collected throughout his life, as well as the material history of the house itself. So the wall that we're looking at is lined with vitrines that showcase Castle's jar of soot, drawing tools, and some of the things that he collected, among many, many items. The wall opposite showcases a sort of visual timeline of the building materials of the house, featuring layers of the materials the Castle family used when altering both the interior and the exterior of the house. And the wall to the east side of the room is particularly interesting. It features a combination of newspaper and fabric that evidence the clothing the family once wore through visible hems, elastics, and darts. While we don't know who applied these materials, we know that it was done in the mid-1940s based on the dates that are on the newspapers and magazines. One of the purposes of the James Castle House is to continue Castle's legacy of daily creativity on site. We do that in part through our Artist in Residence program, which brings artists, writers, filmmakers, and other creative individuals from around the nation to live and work on site for a designated period of time. These terms, which range from 10 days to 10 weeks, have public engagement components, making it possible for our community to meet our residents and learn about the work that they are creating. The residency space is located just behind the main house and includes a studio, kitchenette, private bathroom, bedroom, and entrance. You can see here the relationship between the public space and the private residency space. So in order to get a better sense of the public spaces, we would like to invite you into the house for another virtual fly-through video. All right, so we are currently looking at the James Castle House from Eugene Street. As mentioned, when the Castle family moved here, the lot was about 5 acres. Today, the lot is a little under 1/4 of an acre. So the historic family home is covered in stucco, and the new additions are what are shown with the white siding. And we are approaching what we use as the front door to the James Castle House, which enters into the general store. So as mentioned, the general store is a nod to Castle's parents' store. And if you'll notice, some of the flooring and other fixtures feature design with a 1930s influence, which was based on the time that the Castles actually moved onto this site. So as we go through this pocket door, we're entering the historic family home, which is now the main gallery that we saw. So painstaking work was done by the Department of Arts and History to reveal the original materials that were used to build, insulate, and decorate the house while the Castle family lived here. But a careful renovation effort had to be struck to preserve and present the history that was still visible in the house, while updating the site to be utilized as a multifunctional public space. You can get a pretty good view here of the hardwood floors and the ceiling rafters. So as mentioned, when the castles first moved on site, the original family home was a single room farmhouse, and it measured roughly 12 by 26 feet, so about 312 square feet. The boundary of the original house is indicated by the I-beam and the far wall, above which the rafters of the original roof are still in place. So those are visible here, and this pocket door that we're looking at is actually the entrance into the residency studio space. As the family grew and needed more space, they added on to the house, building over the pre-existing structure rather than demolishing and rebuilding. So the doors that we're looking at here, the door to the left served as the original front door when the family moved in. They added a porch to this side of the house and later enclosed it into 2 bedrooms, at which time the front door was moved to face Eugene Street. So this is the back bedroom that we just explored through some pictures. It's hard to really get a sense of how magical this space is until you're inside of it. We've got a really great photograph of James Castle on the wall, standing inside of the shed, holding up a book of his artwork. And the mystery mural wall. So after the porch additions, the family had also made later additions to the south side of the house that included a kitchen, a bedroom, and a bathroom. So as we turn here, we'll see this I-beam would have been the wall that previously had separated the living room from these additional spaces. And this was removed to make this beautiful open gallery space that can serve as a gathering space for exhibitions, talks, performances, and more. So while the house may no longer be a family residence, it still feels a lot like a home. This is a lovely drawing that James Castle did of the house at 5015 Eugene Street. Before I turn things over to Rachel, I just would like to give a shout out to the James Castle Collection and Archive, the Boise State University Special Collection and Archive, and of course the Castle family for sharing their images and recollections with us. We are so happy to have been able to share a little bit about the James Castle House with you all tonight, and we hope that you will come visit us and experience this incredible site in person once it is safe to do so. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kristen, for such an amazing tour of the Castle House. Even though I spend so much time in that space, it's always such a privilege to hear you talk about the house and just how you share your love of Castle. So thank you so much. So for those of you who are anxious to start planning actual road trips beyond the virtual road trip we're offering, I highly recommend checking out this amazing book that was published through the Historic Artist Homes and Studios program. It is the Historic Artist Homes and Studios Guidebook. You can purchase it online through the jamescastlehouse.org website. So this highly visual guidebook shares 256 pages of stunning images of artists and artist sites, stories from each site, all grouped by US region. So basically making it nearly impossible to drive past any one of these sites on an actual road trip. So now I'd like to open us up for questions. So feel free to send your questions into us through the Q&A box. But before we get started, I wanted to just kind of put this out to Valerie to maybe share a little bit more about the HAHS Guidebook, as she is the author of this book, before we get started.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I think what's really exciting about the guidebook is it's the first time all of these sites that comprise the network have been brought together in one virtual place, a book place, so that you can compare and contrast them. And I love that we did it in 2019, which is was our celebratory year of 20 years of the program. And just to give you a sense of what 48 sites can do, it sweeps 22 states. Because we have artist enclaves included in this book, it represents actually the legacies of over 300 artists spanning 3 centuries into the 21st century. And I think what we hope it does is it can provide an entree for someone who's really never studied perhaps art or art sites before, and give them a great breadth of, give them an introduction to the great breadth of artistic heritage in our country. But I also like to think, for those of you out there who are devotees or experts on singular artists, that we've tried to provide something new for you in the book to discover about that and about them and where they worked. And I think the other thing is everyone has their favorite artists. I would urge you to look through the book and pick someone maybe you don't know or you don't necessarily feel an affinity for artistically, and choose to go to that site or read about this artist. And for me, the mark of this book's success is that it will become incredibly well worn, so you can barely read the cover, that the binding will be breaking from all the time it has spent in someone's car or backpack or beside their bedside. If I achieve that, it means we've done our work. So I hope that you'll use this opportunity first to use it virtually and then take it along with you as you go across the country. Thanks, Rachel.
It'll definitely fit perfectly in a glove box. So get it, put it in your car. When it's time, pull it out. So I do have a question that came in for you, Kristen. Can you talk a little bit about whether or not James Castle sold his work during his lifetime?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, James Castle did sell his work through some part of his lifetime. So it was about the last 2 decades, a little under 3 decades. He had a nephew that was attending art school in Portland, Oregon. And his nephew had come back home and brought some of James Castle's works back to school with him to show a professor. And this professor recognized the incredible skill. And so he joined Castle's nephew to come out and visit Boise and get to meet James Castle. And so that kind of got him onto the art world scene a little bit. But he did actually, he had several shows in the Pacific Northwest, and he actually had 2 solo art shows at the Boise Art Museum.
Thanks, Kristen. Another question for you, Kristen. Can you talk a little bit more about the former back bedroom, what the wall looks like in terms of materials, what we mean by collage, if there was anything on top of it before it was uncovered? Maybe just chat a little bit more about what that looks like and feels like.
Yes, so that wall was actually, I failed to mention, it was discovered behind a wall of sheetrock. So it was definitely there from the time the Castle family was there. And it's hard to describe the way that the materials work together. I think one thing that's always struck me is the fact that specifically with the fabric pieces, there are these really beautiful and very distinct patterns. But they're being cut apart and applied to different areas of the wall. So it feels more like it's something that was meant to be more than just functional, because if it was just functional, then there would be no reason to take any aesthetic consideration.
Great, thank you for that. Another question for you, Kristen. How is the Castle House staffed? Are you dependent on volunteers? And then second question, what are you looking for when you accept resident artists into the residency program?
Okay, good question. So the Castle House is staffed. We are, the James Castle House is a part of the Boise Arts and History Department. So we are actually a part of the Boise city government. So our staff are all employees of the city of Boise. We have had some pretty great plans to get a more robust volunteer program in place. And we were just on the verge of getting that started when COVID hit, and there was no real reason to have a lot of in-person volunteers. So we are really hoping to get back into that in the next few months and at least get the process started, wrap our brains around it. With our residents, when we're selecting them, really what it comes down to is the strength of the proposal and the work that they are submitting. So we're really excited for people who are eager to come out here and have a new experience and in some way respond to the experience that they're having on site. Whether that's about, through James Castle, through the house, through the neighborhood, through the city. We want this experience to be immersive in a way that the work that comes from it tells the tale of that immersion.
Awesome, thank you. Another question for you, Kristen, which we may not be able to actually show here, but we had some questions about the interior of the shed, and if we could show pictures, but perhaps you could talk a little bit more about some of the virtual tours that go a little deeper into that and how people can see and understand those spaces more if they so chose to do so.
Yes, absolutely. So we are currently offering 3 regularly scheduled virtual tours. One of them is based on the house that goes a little bit into more depth around the family and the specifics of the house during the time Castle lived here. We have another tour that is just focused on the shed and trailer, and it goes into significantly more depth into both of those spaces. And we do include a lot of pictures, photographs, and drawings of the shed interior. And then the third tour is really focused around Castle's artwork and art making practice. And so we're doing these in a regular rotation at this point. So every month we're offering one of these tours, or every month we're offering each of these tours once. So those are all on our website. I highly recommend that you check it out. You can sign up for them. They're free and they're really fun.
Thank you. I have a question for Valerie, actually. There's a note in here that talks about the James Castle House joining HAHS and how dramatically diverse that was in the portfolio of HAHS when we came into that, and wondering if maybe you can talk more about what that means to HAHS and maybe where HAHS is going in that kind of vein.
Sure, I'm happy to. At the time that the Castle House came into HAHS within, I think, 6 months of opening in 2018, it represented a really strong inclusion of the type of artist who would normally be outside of the mainframe, as we say, of artists who have traditionally not been in the canon, although Castle is certainly now known worldwide, but someone who went down a very different artistic path than perhaps others like Georgia O'Keeffe or others who have been in the network. And we do look in the coming year, in the next 2 years, to have a very, very concerted effort to expand the breadth and scope of those types of artists who have traditionally been underrepresented, and that includes self-taught artists like James Castle, but also people of color, indigenous artists, and even women artists, which, although we have a strong representation, not perhaps strong as we would like. And so it also was very unique in that, as we have all seen, this is a very, very humble structure. And so it represents the legacy of the reality of a lot of artists living throughout their entire career in the types of spaces that they work out of. And so we want to look at these other types of buildings as well when we consider sort of what it means to represent HAHS through preserved buildings of artistic creativity. So stay tuned.
Thanks, Valerie. Another question for you, Kristen. It's always a gift to have an artist house preserved. Can you talk more about the origins of the project and how this came into being, as well as how the house connects with its community?
Would you like to answer that question, Rachel? Rachel has been involved in this project since before it even had legs, and so she has all of the history.
It did feel a little awkward asking you that question, but you also can very, you could answer that just as best as I could because you've been involved for so long. Kristen had mentioned that the James Castle House is part of the city of Boise. The city of Boise has a Department of Arts and History, which is the department we all work in. And it was the vision of our director, really, who had been working for many years to save the site in some capacity. It was owned by a private citizen. And so there was discussion around perhaps saving the shed. There was an opportunity to buy the site, and our fearless leader at the Department of Arts and History really went to bat for the site. It was there was a good chance that the site would have been demolished. There's a pretty heavy development scene happening in Boise right now. And so very likely this large corner lot would have become an apartment building. And so our leader, Terry Shoresman, basically just went to our mayor and did what she could to navigate the politics of purchasing a site like this. And with the mayor and our council at the time, we had unanimous support to buy the site. And surprisingly, at the time, the mayor, the direction was, of course, we're going to save the site. We would love to see a residency program. And so the residency program kind of came into the full site program from the beginning, which is pretty rare for these types of places. And so great opportunity for the city of Boise to do a really great job at saving one of its many cultural gems in town. How we work with the community, we had such an amazing opportunity to have neighbors who were extremely supportive of the project from the beginning. We spent a good couple of years working with our neighbors to make sure we had neighborhood buy-in from the beginning. And because we are part of the Department of Arts and History, and we have a long legacy of working with our community through that larger work, it was pretty easy for us to slip into our already established communication channels and networks that were established early on in the department. Kristen, is there anything more you want to add around that? Okay.
No, you bet it all.
Here's a question that's more specific around James Castle. Do we know if he had any artistic mentors or teachers? What did his family think of his artistic output? And was he ever formally exhibited?
Okay, I'm going to go in reverse order. Yes, he was formally exhibited. Several group shows around the Pacific Northwest in museums and galleries. In fact, his first show was at the Portland Art Museum, which was previously affiliated with the school that his nephew was attending. His family was very supportive of his work and I think enjoyed it a lot. There's so many stories about different generational responses to this. The nieces and nephews that wanted nothing more than to be like Uncle Jim and would go sit down and practice drawing with him, and he would give them all sorts of support. His sister and her husband were incredibly supportive of him. They made a real point of making sure that he could do his drawing all day, every day. His sister would gather materials for him and set them out on the kitchen counter every morning so that he had materials to work with. And when the family upgraded their heating system in the house from a wood burning stove to a gas heater, his brother-in-law started going to get soot from the Boise Veterans Hospital because they were still using wood-burning stoves for heat. And as far as artistic mentors, as far as we know, there was no type of official mentorship. But when you take a moment with Castle's work and really start looking through it, you'll see he was kind of a sponge for the material culture, the visual culture. There's direct references, there are transcriptions of different types of materials and cartoons, political cartoons and newspapers, packaging, these things that, you know, we kind of think of as less than art, but they pull from all the same artistic, I want to say manipulations. We know how things like color and contrast and composition can impact people emotionally. And that plays out whether it's in advertising or in fine art. And I think that he looked at all of it all the time.
Thank you, Kristen. I just want to address a few questions that came in that are more particular to visiting the site. So if you were to visit Boise, during a non-COVID time, we are typically open to the public for a variety of public hours. Currently, the site is offering scheduled tours. So if you do come to Boise and want to visit the site, you can go online and schedule a tour. If for some reason there is a time that does not work for you, you can always give us a call or an email, and we can do our best to accommodate you in that regard. I do want to be respectful of everyone's time. So if we did not address your questions, feel free to reach out to us. Tonight's tour is brought to you by the James Castle House, which is a program, as we mentioned, of the Department of Arts and History, and the Historic Artist Homes and Studios program, which again is a program of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. I do want to take a moment to thank all the staff that was involved to get this virtual road trip going. And for Valerie for so fearlessly committing to allow this program to take place, for Kristen for such a delightful tour of the house itself, and to all of you for taking time out of your busy day, hopping onto yet another Zoom call and joining us tonight. Your support means the world to us. So we will pop in, if we haven't already, our contact information if you have more questions that were not answered tonight. And we hope you will join us next month as we adventure into the home and studio of artist David Ireland in San Francisco, California. So thank you so much, and be well, and we will hopefully see you soon.